Earth always expected big news to come from its own leaders, its own scientists, or its own discoveries. No one ever imagined that the most shocking message in human history would come from a voice that didn't belong to any country, any agency, or even the planet itself. It arrived on a quiet morning that started like any other. People were preparing breakfast, rushing to work, checking their phones, and yawning through the early sunlight without any idea of what was about to happen. Every TV channel, radio station, phone screen, and public billboard flickered at the exact same second. At first, most people thought it was a glitch. Some ignored it. Some slapped the side of their screens. Others complained out loud, thinking the power company was at fault again. But then the noise stopped, and the screens turned black. A soft hum filled the air, as if the whole world was holding its breath. A single line of white light appeared on the dark screen, stretching from one side to the other. Then, slowly, it formed a shape like a symbol, or maybe a seal. No one recognized it. It wasn't from any government or organization. It wasn't any language used on Earth. Before anyone could question it, a calm, steady voice began to speak. "Planet Earth," it said. "This is a final public declaration from the Interstellar Council." That was the moment the world froze. In living rooms, cafes, train stations, and schools, people stopped whatever they were doing. Forks hung mid-air. Keys stayed in hands without being turned. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. The message wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply spoken with a tone that held no emotion and no impatience, just truth. For the last 4 decades, the voice continued. "We have attempted contact with your world on matters concerning environmental stability, cross-planetary ethics, and collective safety. We have received no reply." People exchanged confused looks, unsure whether it was some kind of prank. But the tone of the message didn't feel like a prank. It felt too controlled, too precise, too official. Therefore, the voice said, "By unanimous vote, the Council has decided to remove Earth from the list of recognized developing members. Effective immediately, your world is banished from interstellar relations until further notice." Silence followed. 5 seconds of silence that felt like 5 years. Then the voice spoke once more, softer this time, almost as if it expected the planet to interrupt. "Since Earth has not replied to any communication, we assume your species has chosen isolation." The screen flickered again and went dark. Total silence spread across cities, towns, and small villages around the world. Even animals seemed to sense something unusual. Birds paused mid-song. Dogs stared at their owners. People looked at one another with wide eyes, asking the same question without speaking. What was that? No one knew if the message was real. Governments scrambled, calling emergency meetings. News networks kept replaying the broadcast, trying to understand the symbol, the voice, the meaning behind it. Some people thought it was a new movie promotion. Others claimed it was a cyber attic. Others tried to convince themselves it was a misunderstanding or a translated signal from some far-off satellite experiment. But deep inside, many people felt something different, something heavier. The message didn't feel like a joke, and the voice had not demanded anything, threatened anything, or tried to control anything. It simply announced a decision already made. Across the world, the first waves of confusion turned into nervous chatter. People asked the same questions everywhere. What do they mean by banished? Why would they contact us? How could Earth ignore messages for 40 years? Who would hide something like that? In offices, workers gathered around screens. Students questioned their teachers. Families whispered theories around the kitchen table. Everyone wanted answers, but no one had any dot at an international communications center. A group of analysts replayed the message again and again, studying every detail. The symbol on the screen didn't match any known alphabet. The frequency used for the broadcast didn't match any Earth technology. It had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That alone was terrifying. A senior technician looked pale as he studied the bandwidth. He could barely believe what he was seeing. The signal had overridden every device on Earth at the same exact moment. It wasn't something any country could have done, not even the most advanced. The younger analyst tried to lighten the mood by joking that if beings from somewhere else really wanted to talk, they should have picked a better time than early morning. But no one laughed. The room stayed tense, filled with the sound of keyboards clicking like nervous fingernails. Meanwhile, people who normally didn't talk to each other found themselves having long conversations. Strangers discussed it in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in line for the bus. It felt like the world had suddenly become one giant room where everyone was trying to make sense of a puzzle, with missing pieces in a small newsroom. A reporter reread the transcript she had typed out 3 times already. Something about the message bothered her more than the announcement itself. She kept circling the same sentence. For the last 4 decades, we have attempted contact. Why would they say that? If signals had been sent for 40 years, someone would have known. Someone had to. The reporter felt a chill crawl up her arms. She sensed there was more to the story, something hidden beneath the surface. She began calling old engineers, retired workers, anyone who might know something. Most of them laughed politely, saying they had never seen anything like it. But a few hesitated before answering. Their voices grew quieter, almost shaky. They mentioned odd technical anomalies from decades ago, signals that didn't match any known origin but were dismissed as mistakes. They mentioned memos that disappeared, files that were closed without explanation, and supervisors warning them not to waste resources chasing ghost frequencies. The reporter wrote everything down, her fingers trembling slightly. Something wasn't adding up. In crowded markets, where people usually focused only on daily routines, conversations shifted to theories and fears. Some were worried about what banished meant. Others wondered if this would change travel routes, trade deals, or scientific research. Some even joked nervously, saying Earth wasn't invited to the universe's big party. But beneath the jokes was a deeper feeling, almost like embarrassment. It felt strange to imagine a universe full of life, watching Earth, trying to speak to it, and receiving nothing but silence in return. Children asked their parents whether someone out there was angry with Earth. Parents didn't know how to answer. How do you explain to a child that the world might have ignored messages from somewhere beyond the sky? A retired scientist sat alone in his living room, replaying the broadcast for the 10th time. He had worked on satellite communication during his youth and remembered unusual readings that nobody took seriously. He remembered being told not to discuss them. He wondered if those readings were part of the council's messages. He felt a deep ache in his chest, thinking of how much could have changed if someone had listened. On social media, confusion mixed with panic. Some people claimed Earth was in danger. Others accused governments of hiding the truth for years. A few insisted it was all fake. But even those who tried to deny it couldn't explain the flawless global broadcast. The world felt smaller, quieter, and strangely united, everyone thinking about the same thing at the same time. In a desert observatory, a researcher listened to the recording with headphones, closing her eyes to isolate the faint background tones behind the voice. She noticed something others missed, a pattern hidden in the hum, a kind of signature, as if the voice wasn't a single speaker, but a collective one. The hum carried multiple layers of meaning, too complex for humans to replicate. She opened her eyes slowly and whispered to herself, this wasn't faked. Not by anyone here. In a busy city square, a middle-aged man, who had always been skeptical of anything beyond Earth, now felt something he had never felt before. Not fear, not excitement, something like responsibility. If the message was real, then Earth wasn't just a blue dot in space. It was a participant in something much bigger. And somehow, Earth had failed to answer. Throughout the day, leaders from different countries held emergency conferences. Some urged calm. Others tried to reassure the public that life would continue normally. But people could tell from their expressions that they were just as confused as everyone else. Late that afternoon, a global statement was released. It was short, careful, and left many questions unanswered. We have no record of receiving any communication from the Interstellar Council. We are investigating the incident. That only made people more uneasy. If Earth had never received messages, why did the Council claim it had been trying for 40 years? Who was telling the truth? Could the Council be mistaken? Or was there something Earth didn't know? As night fell, cities glowed with lights as usual, but the air felt different. Conversations drifted through open windows. People looked up at the sky more often than usual, staring at the stars, wondering who or what might be watching them dot in a quiet apartment at the edge of the city. A young technician who worked in old satellite archives turned on his small desk lamp and began searching through dusty storage boxes. Something in the broadcast had stirred a memory he had tried to forget, a memory of an odd signal he had once found buried in outdated logs. No one had believed him then. He wondered if he should have pushed harder. He pulled out an old notebook, flipping through pages filled with sketches of strange waveforms and rough notes. He stared at them, feeling a tight knot in his stomach. One of the patterns looked very similar to the symbol that appeared on every screen that morning. He whispered under his breath, "This isn't the first time we've seen them." A soft breeze moved through his open window, brushing the corner of the notebook. He realized his hands were shaking. It was the first moment he understood that this wasn't just a communication issue. It was something deeper, maybe even intentional. Someone somewhere had stopped the messages from reaching the world dot, and if that was true, Earth wasn't banished because it refused to respond. Earth was banished because it never got the chance. The technician closed the notebook slowly, feeling a mix of fear and determination. He knew he couldn't be the only one who had noticed something. Others must have seen the same signs. Others must have questions too. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, full of stars that suddenly felt closer than ever. The world was unsettled, confused, and searching for answers. But something else was beginning to, something quiet. Something important. People everywhere felt it. Though no one said it out loud. The silence the Council accused Earth of wasn't just between planets. It was also between people. Countries, agencies, and those who knew the truth. And now that silence was breaking, the first step toward understanding had begun slowly, quietly, one uncertain moment at a time. After the morning broadcast, the world was restless. People returned to their routines, but nothing felt normal. Streets were busy, offices full, classrooms crowded, but everywhere there was a quiet tension, a shared unease. No one could stop thinking about the message. Even those who had tried to dismiss it felt its weight pressing on their minds. At a small research facility on the outskirts of a major city, a team of communication analysts gathered to study the incident. They had worked together for years, mostly handling signals from satellites and deep space experiments. That morning, they had been called into emergency duty without warning. Their task was simple in words, but impossible in practice. Figure out if the message was real, and if so, why Earth had received nothing for decades. The senior analyst leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "We need to assume this is not a prank," he said. His voice was calm, but tense. "We've seen glitches, hacks, and false signals before. This is something else." The team began reviewing archived satellite records. They dug through decades of transmissions, checking frequencies, signal patterns, and storage logs. They had to work fast. The world was watching, waiting for an answer they could not provide. Every once in a while, a member of the team would stop, pointing at a spike in the recording or a signal that didn't make sense. Each anomaly was tiny on its own, but together they suggested a history of interference that nobody could explain. Meanwhile, outside the lab, life went on, or at least it tried to. Cafes filled with the quiet buzz of conversations about the broadcast. People debated what banished meant. Some laughed nervously at jokes about aliens refusing to accept Earth into a galactic club. Others whispered theories about secret messages, government cover-ups, or cosmic punishment. Even in small towns far from any city, the message dominated every conversation. In a remote observatory high on a mountain, a researcher carefully adjusted her instruments, trying to detect any lingering traces of the Council's transmission. Her focus was intense. She had spent years tracking cosmic signals, but nothing had prepared her for the precision of what she was hearing. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a carefully layered message with tones and rhythms that no human technology could reproduce. Somewhere, somehow, Earth had missed decades of communication, and no one knew why. The researcher called an old colleague who had retired years ago. They spoke quietly over the phone, sharing memories of unusual satellite signals that had been dismissed as errors. "You're not imagining this," the colleague said. "We saw things that never made sense, things that could have been messages. Nobody wanted to investigate. They said it would cost too much." His voice faltered. "Maybe this is why." Back in the city, news outlets scrambled. Reports poured in from all over the world, each one more confused than the last. Headlines asked, "Did we ignore them? Are we alone in this? What does banished mean?" Social media platforms exploded with speculation. Some people argued that the Council must have been mistaken. Others insisted humanity had failed to respond. Few realized that even governments had no record of receiving any prior messages. No one knew what to believe, and fear mixed with curiosity everywhere. A group of engineers at a private aerospace company began reviewing old communication logs, hoping to find clues. They dug through decades of paperwork and outdated recordings. At first, they found nothing. But then, hidden in a forgotten folder labeled Test Frequencies 1979 to 1985, they discovered faint patterns that matched the strange symbols seen on screens during the broadcast. The engineers stared in disbelief. Could this be the proof that messages had indeed reached Earth long ago? They shared the discovery with a historian of science, a quiet woman who had spent her life documenting experiments that never became famous. She examined the data carefully and confirmed what the engineers suspected. Signals matching the Council's style had been received but never acted upon. "Someone," she whispered, "someone must have prevented the messages from reaching anyone who could respond." This idea sent ripples through the small team. The implication was massive. If true, humanity had been silenced, not ignoring. And if humanity had been silenced, the Council's declaration of banishment was based on a misunderstanding, or maybe even on a manipulation beyond Earth's control. Meanwhile, ordinary people were starting to feel the first effects of the banishment. Businesses dependent on satellite communication noticed delays and anomalies in their data. Shipping companies reported interference in GPS signals. Space agencies suddenly found funding frozen for projects that required international collaboration. Even though no one had yet met the Council, its absence was being felt. In one small town, a group of students gathered after school to discuss what they had seen on the news. They argued about whether Earth had failed, whether someone had hidden the messages, and whether the Council would ever respond again. One student, quiet until then, spoke up. "Maybe we weren't ready," he said. Maybe they were trying to warn us, and someone stopped it. Not us. Someone else. Across the globe, similar conversations unfolded. Families, coworkers, and strangers all noticed the same thing. The story was bigger than governments, bigger than technology. It touched something deep inside everyone, forcing people to question what it meant to be human, what it meant to belong to a world watched by something greater. At a small home office, a retired communications specialist dug through decades-old notebooks and log sheets. He remembered a frequency anomaly from the early 1980s that he had reported to supervisors, only to be told it was noise and to ignore it. Now, looking back, he realized it could have been a council message. His hands trembled as he marked the pages. For years, he had thought he was imagining things. Now the truth was clearer. Someone had silenced the signals. News of these discoveries slowly spread. Analysts, scientists, and journalists began sharing what they had learned online. People reacted with a mix of relief, anger, and disbelief. Some celebrated the idea that humanity had not failed on its own. Others were furious at the idea that decades of interference had gone unnoticed or unchallenged. The young technician from Part 1 stayed awake long into the night, cross-referencing old satellite logs with the Council's broadcast patterns. Each discovery added weight to the growing realization. Messages had been received, but hidden. A deep sadness settled over him. "We could have answered," he whispered. "We could have been part of something bigger." As days passed, the world adjusted to the new reality. Governments continued investigations, but the public began taking matters into their own hands. Amateur radio operators scanned the skies for unusual frequencies. Students created online networks to share findings. Ordinary people, once focused only on their daily routines, became part of a global search for answers. In one coastal city, fishermen noticed strange patterns in the tides that did not match any forecast. They joked nervously about whether this had anything to do with the Council's banishment. Scientists examined their reports and discovered nothing unusual, but the stories spread, mixing fact with fear and wonder. People were starting to look at the world differently, as if every small detail might hold a clue. Meanwhile, the researcher at the Mountain Observatory discovered an even more remarkable fact. The Council's message carried a rhythm that matched patterns from earlier signals, patterns she had recorded decades ago, but dismissed as random cosmic noise. The more she analyzed, the clearer it became. Earth had been capable of responding all along, if only someone had noticed the signals. The realization was both exciting and heartbreaking. Across the world, small groups of citizens began forming informal networks. They shared information, cross-checked facts, and debated theories. No one claimed to have all the answers, but they were united by a single purpose: to understand what had happened and why humanity had been silenced. This movement was spontaneous, unorganized, yet powerful. It was a reminder that the Council's banishment was not just a cosmic statement, it was now a human story. And people were determined to write its next chapter. In one suburban home, a young student stared at the stars from his bedroom window. His eyes followed the constellations, but his mind followed the questions. Who had been listening to Earth? Why had they been ignored? And if the signals had been blocked, by whom? The questions had no answers yet, but they sparked a feeling of responsibility. A sense that understanding this could change the way humanity thought about itself forever. By the end of the week, the evidence had mounted. Multiple signals had been received over decades, hidden by technical anomalies, forgotten logs, or human error. Governments released partial findings, confirming that Earth had not responded, not because of negligence, but because the messages never reached the right channels. The public reacted with a mix of relief and anger. Relief that humanity had not failed entirely on its own. Anger that it had been robbed of its opportunity. The world had begun to understand something important. The banishment was not final judgment. It was a reflection of how fragile communication could be, how easily important information could be lost, and how unprepared humanity was for contact beyond its planet dot and homes. Offices and schools, people began asking new questions. What could be done now? Could humanity send a reply? Would the Council ever listen again? And most importantly, what lessons could be learned from decades of silence? Even as uncertainty lingered, one thing was clear. Earth had been given a second chance, whether or not it had been intentional. The task now was not just about answering the Council. It was about understanding itself. For the first time in decades, people were paying attention to signals that might have been invisible before. And slowly, they were learning to listen by the second week after the broadcast. Something remarkable happened. Ordinary citizens began sharing memories of strange signals, odd patterns in old satellite recordings, and unexplained anomalies. Retired engineers, hobbyists, and students all contributed to a growing picture of what had been happening. People realized they were part of a global puzzle that could not be solved alone. For the first time, humanity felt connected not just to each other, but to something beyond Earth itself. And in that connection, a quiet hope began to grow. If messages had been blocked before, maybe they could be heard now. If humanity had been silenced once, maybe it could speak now. The world felt smaller, yet bigger. Every glance at the stars carried weight. Every whisper, every memory, every discovery mattered. The realization that humans had not ignored the Council, but had been prevented from responding, transformed fear into determination. People understood that silence was not always consent. And now, Earth had a chance to make its voice heard. That night, across the planet, people looked up at the same sky. Some whispered prayers. Some made plans. Some simply stared, absorbing the vastness of what they had just realized. Fourth days after the discoveries became quieter on the surface, but beneath the calm, the world was alive with questions, debates, and quiet determination. People had begun to understand that the Council's claim was not entirely true. Humanity had not ignored them. Someone or something had blocked the messages. The weight of that truth settled heavily on minds everywhere, leaving a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that humanity had not failed on its own. Frustration because decades of opportunity had been lost. In city apartments, houses, and offices, ordinary people began to feel a strange sense of urgency. Conversations that had once revolved around work, school, and routine now shifted to ideas about responsibility and awareness. Families discussed whether the world had been ready for such contact. Friends debated whether humans deserved a second chance. Even children, who usually accepted the world as it was, asked new questions about stars, signals, and the lives of others somewhere beyond the sky. In one small research lab tucked in a quiet industrial area, a group of engineers and technicians gathered daily, piecing together fragments of old signals from decades past. They had discovered multiple recordings that seemed to match the Council's communication patterns. Each signal was weak, incomplete, and buried in noise, but when combined, they formed a story, a series of instructions, warnings, and requests that humanity had unknowingly missed. The lead engineer looked at the others and said quietly, "We have proof now. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't ignorance. Someone stopped the messages. But we can't panic. We need to figure out what it means and how to respond." The team worked long hours, often forgetting meals, sleep, or even simple breaks. They cross-checked old logs, consulted retired scientists, and reconstructed the signals using modern technology. Every anomaly revealed another layer of information, hinting at a Council that had been patient, careful, and observant for decades. The sheer precision of the signals left the team in awe. Whoever had sent them was advanced, beyond anything humans had imagined. Yet their messages had been hidden by something simple, terrestrial, and human-made. Outside the lab, the public's reaction evolved. Social media was alive with debate, speculation, and shared discoveries. Some people began posting their own experiences of strange signals, unexplained technical errors, or memories of anomalies that had seemed insignificant in the moment. Retired engineers shared stories of warnings they had seen decades ago but had been told to ignore. Students compiled lists, charts, and possible explanations. The sense of shared purpose created a new kind of energy in the world. People were paying attention, listening for things they never thought they would notice in schools. Teachers adjusted lessons to include discussions about communication, responsibility, and collective action. Students learned to question not just the signals they saw in space, but the information they received at home, at school, and from governments. They asked why messages could be blocked, who controlled them, and how to ensure humanity was never silenced again. Some students began building small devices to detect unusual frequencies, joining the effort in ways that were both playful and serious. Meanwhile, governments continued to investigate, but progress was slow. Bureaucracy and secrecy made it difficult for information to flow freely. Some officials worried about public panic. Others feared international embarrassment if it became known that decades of messages had been blocked. Yet the pressure from the public grew stronger every day. Citizens demanded transparency, and even the most cautious leaders could not ignore the movement forming outside the official channels. In one quiet suburb, a retired scientist had begun meeting with a small group of neighbors to share his experiences with unusual satellite readings from decades ago. They pored over old logbooks, handwritten notes, and discarded tapes, reconstructing what had been missed. Each discovery brought a mixture of wonder and sorrow. They realized that Earth had been under observation for a long time, and that humanity had unknowingly been silent in response. The weight of lost opportunity settled on them, but it also inspired a quiet determination. If messages had been blocked once, they would ensure no future communication would be ignored. The discovery of the blocked signals also had personal consequences. Many people began to examine their own lives, wondering how they had missed opportunities to act, speak, or pay attention. Individuals who had once felt powerless began realizing that attention, awareness, and action mattered. People started documenting small anomalies in their surroundings, thinking about patterns, and questioning the ordinary. A sense of responsibility spread, subtle but unstoppable. Humanity had learned that even small lapses could have far-reaching consequences. One day, the lead engineer from the lab received a call from a government research agency. The official on the line spoke carefully. "We've reviewed your findings," they said. "It appears your analysis is accurate. Signals were received and blocked, possibly for decades. We need your help to understand the scale and decide next steps." The engineer felt a mix of relief and anxiety. "We can help," he said, "but the public should know what has been happening. People have a right to understand." The official paused, then replied, "We'll consider it. For now, continue your work." While official channels moved slowly, ordinary people continued their efforts with increasing energy. Communities formed local networks to monitor for unusual transmissions, coordinate research, and share findings. People who had never interacted before found themselves working together, united by a common goal. It was not a political effort. It was human. It was curiosity, responsibility, and hope rolled into one. In a small apartment high above the city, a young student spent nights decoding old radio signals. Using simple equipment, they had begun isolating patterns that seemed too organized to be random. Each discovery felt like a small victory, a step toward understanding the broader truth. They documented every finding carefully, aware that even small errors could mislead the community trying to understand what had happened. At the same time, journalists continued to investigate. They interviewed retired scientists, engineers, and ordinary people who remembered unusual events. Articles were published that traced the hidden signals, showing that evidence of contact had existed for decades but had never reached decision-makers. The world slowly began to realize that the Council had been right in one way. Humanity had not responded. But the reason was not ignorance or arrogance. It was interference, human-made and unintentional, yet devastating in effect. Families around the world began to share their stories. One grandmother described the strange hum she had noticed on an old radio as a child. A father remembered a series of unexplained satellite images he had once worked on. A teacher recalled anomalies in early computer networks that had been dismissed. Each story added depth, complexity, and humanity to what had once seemed like an abstract problem. It was no longer just about space or signals. It was about people noticing, acting, and sometimes failing to act. The sense of collective responsibility grew stronger. In neighborhoods, small groups began holding informal meetings, discussing ways to ensure humanity would never again fail to respond. They worked to preserve historical data, educate younger generations, and encourage awareness of the wider universe. Children learned the importance of attention, curiosity, and communication. Adults realized that vigilance was not just technical, it was moral and social. Humanity was learning to listen in ways it had never learned before. Despite the growing sense of purpose, frustration lingered. Some people were angry at the delays, the cover-ups, and the inefficiencies that had prevented Earth from responding. Others felt sorrow, thinking about decades lost, opportunities wasted, and messages unheard. Yet even as frustration spread, it was tempered by hope. People were beginning to understand that mistakes of the past could guide future actions. The recognition of error did not paralyze them. It motivated them. At the same time, governments, while cautious, could not ignore the public energy. International committees were formed, bringing together scientists, engineers, historians, and educators to examine the findings. Conferences were held, debates were moderated, and protocols were drafted for future communication. The effort was slow and methodical, but it had begun. Humanity was finally moving toward an organized response. Even as individuals continued their informal investigations. In a coastal city, a retired engineer visited a small museum dedicated to the history of space exploration. He had brought old equipment, tapes, and notes. Museum staff were fascinated, and soon local schools became involved. Students helped digitize the old records, creating a public archive for future generations. The work was tedious, but every contribution mattered. Every person who engaged added a small but crucial piece to the larger story of humanity's near-missed opportunity. Across the globe, ordinary citizens became historians, archivists, and communicators. They were no longer passive observers. They sought, questioned, and shared. They were rebuilding the bridge between Earth and the universe, one discovery, one conversation, one small action at a time. Late one night, in a quiet town far from major cities, a group of friends gathered to discuss the Council's message. They did not fully understand it, but they understood enough to know that action mattered. "We can't wait for governments or scientists alone," one said. "If we care, we have to do something ourselves." They began to catalog anomalies in their environment, unexplained patterns in radio signals, strange images captured by amateur telescopes, even subtle changes in electrical grids that seemed unusual. They shared their findings online, hoping others would notice connections. Within weeks, small networks like theirs had formed in multiple countries, linking ordinary people through curiosity, responsibility, and shared effort. The realization spread slowly but powerfully. Humanity had the ability to respond now. The mistakes of the past were lessons, not final judgment. If Earth had been silenced before, it would not remain silent forever. People everywhere began to understand that their role in the universe was not passive observation. It was active participation. They were listening, documenting, learning, and preparing to speak when the time came. And slowly, as people shared, recorded, and collaborated, a new sense of purpose emerged. Humanity began to act as one, fragmented in some ways, diverse in others, but united by a desire to understand and respond. The Council's message had been ignored for decades, but now it had ignited something far stronger, a global awakening dot in homes. Offices and classrooms, people kept looking to the sky, not in fear, but in curiosity. Every faint signal, every strange pattern, every unexplained anomaly was now seen as a potential message. People listened differently. They noticed more. They questioned more. And they shared more. The blocked signals had once kept humanity silent. Now, the traces of those signals were teaching the world how to listen and how to prepare to respond. Every small discovery, every memory, every record collected was a step toward understanding the universe and humanity's place in it. By the end of the third week, ordinary people, scientists, students, and engineers had created something unexpected, a network of awareness, collaboration, and preparation. It was decentralized, informal, and human-centered. No government controlled it. No corporation led it. It was humanity acting as itself, curious, responsible, and ready to face what might come. The Council's message, though unresponded to for decades, had not been in vain. Its silence had sparked reflection, investigation, and growth. Humanity had begun to awaken to the responsibility of being part of a larger universe. The work was only beginning, but for the first time, people felt that their voices, their actions, and their awareness could matter beyond the world they knew. And somewhere, deep in the archives of old satellite logs, in notebooks tucked away in quiet homes, and in the minds of curious children and adults alike, the first pieces of a reply were slowly starting to take shape, not yet complete, not yet sent, but growing clearer every day. Humanity was no longer silent. The weeks passed quietly, but beneath the surface, a storm of discovery was building. The signals that had once been blocked were slowly being traced, decoded, and understood. Ordinary people, scientists, students, and engineers all contributed pieces of a puzzle that no single person could solve alone. Each new finding added clarity to a story that had remained hidden for decades. And the weight of that story began to dawn on humanity. The Council's messages had not reached anyone, but they had been real. In a small coastal city, a retired aerospace engineer had discovered a collection of old hard drives, tucked away in the basement of a defunct research facility. The drives were dusty, some had rust along the edges, and many had been marked as obsolete. He had nearly thrown them away, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps the growing sense that the world was looking for answers. He carefully connected the drives to an old computer and began exploring their contents. What he found was extraordinary. The drives contained logs, images, and encrypted messages that perfectly matched the patterns of the Council's transmissions. It was as if someone had been recording every message the Council sent, only to hide it away in a vault, forgotten and sealed from the world. The realization struck him hard. Humanity had not been ignoring the Council. It had been deliberately blocked from seeing the truth. The engineer called an old colleague who had once worked with him on satellite communications. Together, they began unpacking the files, piece by piece. The files contained everything: raw signal data, translations, timestamps, and notes on the importance of each message. The scale of the archive was immense, covering decades of attempted contact. As they examined the records, a mixture of awe, frustration, and sorrow filled them. Humanity had been silenced, not by choice, but by circumstances that now needed to be understood. Across the world, similar discoveries began to emerge. A historian of science had located a series of old notebooks from a private aerospace company. The notebooks contained detailed records of anomalies that had been dismissed as errors. Engineers had documented strange patterns in satellite signals, but had been instructed to ignore them. They had written warnings that were never forwarded to decision-makers. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The messages had reached Earth, but human systems bureaucracy, negligence, and secrecy had prevented them from being acted upon. The story was no longer just about signals from space. It had become a story about humanity itself, its mistakes, its failures, and its capacity for awareness when given the chance. Ordinary citizens were beginning to understand that the Council's banishment had not been a judgment, but a reflection of human shortcomings. And yet, the knowledge of what had been lost sparked determination. People wanted to correct the past and prepare for the future. In one small apartment, high above the city, a young technician sifted through decades of old satellite records. Each anomaly, each unexplained pattern began to make sense. The symbols, tones, and frequencies matched those now visible in the hidden archive. The technician realized that the messages had not been simple warnings. They had contained instructions, guidance, and advice intended to help humanity avoid errors that could have long-term consequences. For decades, those instructions had gone unread. Meanwhile, journalists were piecing together the story. Interviews with retired engineers, technicians, and scientists revealed a consistent pattern. Signals that should have reached authorities had been blocked, misfiled, or dismissed. Files had disappeared. Logs had been erased. Even when anomalies were reported, they were often ignored or labeled as errors. The more journalists uncovered, the clearer it became that a silent blockade had existed, not an external force, but human error compounded by secrecy and fear. One retired engineer admitted in an interview, his voice trembling, "We thought we were protecting the public from panic. We thought no one could understand it anyway. But now I see that silence was a mistake. We could have responded. We should have responded." Public reaction was intense. Citizens felt both anger and relief. Anger at the years of secrecy, at the missed opportunities, at the failures of institutions that were meant to protect and inform. Relief that humanity had not ignored the Council by choice. The banishment was not a punishment. It was a misunderstanding caused by human errors and miscommunication. Communities around the world began forming small groups dedicated to transparency and investigation. People who had never worked together before shared resources, compared notes, and collaborated to uncover the full extent of the hidden archive. Each person contributed what they could: technical expertise, historical knowledge, analytical skills, or simply dedication and time. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle came together. Humanity was beginning to reclaim what had been lost. In a small museum of space history, a curator displayed some of the recovered materials. Old hard drives, handwritten notes, and reconstructed signals were presented for public viewing. Visitors were fascinated, but more importantly, they began to understand that the Council's messages were not abstract. They were lessons, instructions, and warnings intended for all of humanity. The exhibit became a place of reflection, a quiet reminder of what had been missed and what could still be done. At the same time, scientists at observatories around the world continued to analyze the signals. They discovered subtle patterns within the Council's messages, patterns that suggested the Council had observed Earth's environment, technology, and social systems carefully. The messages were designed not to punish, but to guide, to help humanity recognize potential dangers and take action before errors became catastrophic. The realization sparked hope. Even though the messages had been blocked, the guidance was still relevant. Humanity could still act, learn, and improve. In a suburban home, a retired teacher and a small group of neighbors began to study old records and signals together. They shared stories of anomalies they had noticed in their own lives, unusual noises on radios, or strange patterns in technology that had seemed meaningless at the time. They began to piece together a timeline of events, mapping the Council's attempts to communicate over decades. The process was slow and painstaking, but it brought them together in a shared sense of purpose. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the blockages were not intentional in the sense of maliciousness. They were the result of fear, bureaucratic caution, and a lack of understanding. Decisions made to prevent panic or avoid embarrassment had inadvertently silenced humanity for decades. And yet, even as anger surfaced, there was recognition that people had acted in the ways they thought best at the time. By the end of the month, a pattern emerged. The hidden archive showed that messages had been sent consistently, often with increasing urgency. Some messages contained specific instructions about technology, environmental practices, and international cooperation. Others were warnings about neglecting certain responsibilities or failing to respond to global crises. It became clear that the Council had been patient, giving humanity time to learn and act. But the opportunity had been blocked from being received. Ordinary citizens began to realize the importance of collective action. They formed small networks to ensure that future signals would not be lost. They documented anomalies, maintained public archives, and educated others about the history of blocked messages. Awareness spread not only in technical circles, but also in communities, schools, and workplaces. Humanity was learning a new way to pay attention, to listen, and to respond. In a quiet coastal town, a group of students set up their own small observatory. They built devices to detect unusual signals and mapped patterns over days and weeks. Every small discovery was shared online, adding to a growing body of collective knowledge. Their work demonstrated that even young people could contribute to understanding the hidden archive and reconnecting with the guidance that had been missed. At the same time, governments were beginning to act more openly. Some released parts of their findings to the public. Committees were formed to examine the historical blockages and develop new protocols to ensure future communication could not be ignored. While progress was slow, the collaboration between citizens and officials showed a remarkable change in attitude. Humanity was learning to take responsibility for its own voice and its own attention. In one home office, a young analyst reviewed old tapes, cross-referencing the signals with timestamps from the Council's transmissions. Each match confirmed the earlier discoveries. Earth had been capable of responding, but the opportunity had been obstructed. He realized that every small detail mattered. Every missed report, every discarded log, every unrecorded signal contributed to decades of silence. Yet the realization did not paralyze him. It motivated him to work harder, to share findings, and to help rebuild humanity's capacity to listen. Communities worldwide began organizing educational programs, workshops, and public discussions. People wanted everyone to understand what had happened, to see the hidden archive, and to learn lessons about communication, responsibility, and awareness. Schools introduced exercises that encouraged students to notice patterns, record observations, and analyze information critically. Libraries and museums preserved recovered records. The message was clear. Humanity had been silenced once, but it would not remain silent again. Amid all the investigations, a quiet truth became evident. The Council had not banished Earth out of anger or malice. The banishment had been a reflection of silence, a response to a world that appeared unresponsive. Now, with the hidden archive uncovered, humanity understood that the Council's patience and observation had been constant. The opportunity to reconnect existed, but it required deliberate action and collective attention. Ordinary people felt the weight of responsibility. The realization that decades of silence had been caused by preventable factors inspired determination. They worked to ensure that future communication could never be ignored. They documented, educated, and collaborated. Humanity was not just preparing to respond, it was learning how to prevent failure in the future. In a quiet room, a historian carefully pieced together the timeline of blocked messages. Each entry, each note, each recovered signal revealed a consistent pattern. The Council had attempted contact repeatedly, often adapting methods to ensure understanding. Yet each attempt had been hidden or dismissed. The historian shook his head in disbelief. The scale of oversight, combined with decades of human caution, had created an unintended silence. Yet now, humanity could correct it. By the end of the investigation, the world had changed. People were more attentive, collaborative, and aware. The hidden archive had not only revealed what had been missed, it had shown that humanity could act collectively, learn from mistakes, and prepare to reconnect. The discovery sparked hope, determination, and a sense of responsibility unlike anything before. The blocked messages had once seemed like a tragedy. Now they were a lesson. Humanity had been silenced, not by choice, but by circumstance. And now, for the first time, Earth had the tools, knowledge, and awareness to respond, to learn, and to engage with the wider universe. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the world had begun to walk it together. With the hidden archive finally uncovered, humanity faced a new challenge: what to do next. The past could no longer be changed. Decades of blocked messages and missed opportunities were gone, but the present offered something more valuable: knowledge, awareness, and a chance to respond. People everywhere felt a quiet urgency, a shared understanding that action was necessary. This was not a government project, not a corporate effort. It was humanity itself, awakening to responsibility. In cities and towns across the globe, small groups had formed to study the recovered messages. Engineers, students, teachers, and ordinary citizens worked together, sharing files, comparing patterns, and discussing interpretations. Some of the messages were technical, detailing the Council's observations of Earth's atmosphere, magnetic fields, and energy consumption. Others were more philosophical, addressing human behavior, cooperation, and ethics. It was clear that the Council had tried to guide Earth gently, offering advice and insight while waiting patiently for a response. A young analyst in a quiet apartment labored over one particularly complex signal. It contained multiple layers of information: a base message, a set of encoded instructions, and subtle harmonics meant to be interpreted as context. Hours passed as the analyst cross-referenced old files, mapped signal frequencies, and decoded hidden patterns. Every small breakthrough felt monumental. For the first time, the analyst understood the depth of the Council's patience and the scale of humanity's lost opportunity. Meanwhile, in schools, educators introduced lessons about the discovery. Students learned not just about the science behind the signals, but also about attention, responsibility, and collective action. Exercises encouraged students to observe patterns in nature, technology, and communication. They were taught that small actions recording a detail, noticing an anomaly, sharing knowledge could have profound consequences. For many students, this was a revelation, a lesson that extended far beyond the classroom, reaching into the stars themselves, across the world. Retired scientists and engineers volunteered their time to assist with analysis. They pored over decades-old satellite records, old communications logs, and archived research papers. Many admitted they had once been part of the system that had inadvertently blocked the messages. Some were haunted by the realization, while others felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, these volunteers helped reconstruct the Council's communications and prepared them for the World's understanding. Ordinary citizens played a crucial role as well. Hobbyists with radio equipment, amateur astronomers, and even school children began sharing unusual observations. Patterns previously ignored were now studied with care. A faint signal picked up by a student telescope could be matched to a decades-old transmission, adding clarity to the Council's messages. The collaboration between professionals and civilians created a network of insight that had never existed before. Governments, at first slow to act, were gradually drawn into the global effort. Emergency committees were formed, bringing together scientists, engineers, and representatives from multiple countries. They coordinated access to historical records, verified discoveries, and ensured that research could continue without obstruction. Transparency became a guiding principle, driven by the public's insistence on accountability and collaboration. Humanity was learning from its past mistakes. In one suburban home, a retired teacher led a small group of neighbors in a daily study session. They reviewed decoded messages, compared anomalies, and discussed interpretations. The teacher emphasized that understanding the messages was not just technical, it was human. The Council's instructions often referenced cooperation, awareness, and ethical behavior, reminding everyone that communication was as much about understanding one another as it was about technology. In another part of the world, a group of university students worked to translate the most complex signals into understandable terms. They created diagrams, timelines, and models that could be shared with anyone, not just scientists. Their work made the Council's messages accessible, and the public began to grasp the depth of what had been missed. Each translation, each diagram, was a step toward reconnecting with the Council and reclaiming humanity's voice. As the work progressed, discussions turned toward action. It was no longer enough to study the past. Humanity needed to respond. The Council had been patient, but the messages had to be acknowledged. Leaders, educators, scientists, and ordinary people debated the best way to construct a reply. What should Earth say? How could humans express awareness, responsibility, and readiness after decades of silence? The conversations were complicated, but deeply human. Some argued for a message that emphasized humility, acknowledging past mistakes and the lessons learned. Others suggested focusing on cooperation, showing that humans could work together despite differences. Still others felt that highlighting achievements, creativity, and compassion would demonstrate readiness for participation in interstellar dialogue. Every voice mattered, and every discussion helped refine the collective understanding of what humanity could convey. In a small lab, a technician experimented with ways to transmit the reply. Unlike the Council's signals, which had been carefully layered and subtle, humanity needed clarity. The message had to be unmistakable, detectable across vast distances, and capable of being interpreted accurately. The technician worked day and night, testing frequencies, signal patterns, and coding methods. Each iteration brought new insights, as well as new challenges. Humanity had to be precise, yet expressive. Technical accuracy alone was not enough. The message had to carry understanding. Ordinary citizens contributed ideas as well. Some suggested including aspects of Earth's diversity: music, language, art, and culture to illustrate humanity's complexity. Others recommended explaining how humans had learned from mistakes and were now capable of vigilance, cooperation, and moral responsibility. Slowly, a shared vision emerged. The reply would not be just technical data. It would be humanity's story, told with honesty and care. At the same time, educators continued to instill awareness in younger generations. Children learned not just the science behind signals, but also the importance of observation, responsibility, and ethical action. They were encouraged to notice details, record anomalies, and share insights. In classrooms, they discussed what it meant to be part of a species observed by a larger universe. For many, The lesson was both humbling and inspiring. Humanity's voice had been silenced once. Now it would be deliberate, conscious, and human. In homes and community centers, small workshops emerged. People built simple devices to monitor signals, learned basic coding for message construction, and discussed the council's guidance. These workshops were informal but powerful. Ordinary people, from retirees to teenagers, contributed to the creation of a response. Knowledge was no longer confined to experts. It belonged to everyone who cared enough to participate. Meanwhile, journalists documented the process. Stories of collaboration, discovery, and innovation spread around the world. Articles highlighted the hidden archive, the decades of missed opportunities, and the efforts of ordinary citizens to reclaim humanity's voice. Public interest grew. People felt that the moment was historic, not just a technical achievement, but a profound human awakening. The process was not without tension. Debates arose over what tone the message should take, what content was most essential, and how to represent the diversity of humanity. Some voices called for humility, others for clarity, and still others for hope and inspiration. Discussions could be heated, but each disagreement reflected a deep engagement with the task. Humanity was learning to negotiate, collaborate, and express itself collectively. In a quiet observatory, scientists tested prototypes of the final message. They combined technical instructions with cultural elements, ethical statements, and historical context. Layers of meaning were carefully constructed, ensuring that the message could not be misinterpreted. They consulted linguists, mathematicians, musicians, and artists, creating a reply that reflected the full spectrum of human understanding. As the final draft took shape, it became clear that the reply was more than a message. It was a declaration. Humanity had listened, learned, and was ready to engage. The words, symbols, and frequencies convey humility, responsibility, curiosity, and hope. Every element was chosen to demonstrate that Earth had understood the consequences of past silence and was now prepared for dialogue. The process of preparing the reply brought humanity closer together. People who had never met collaborated across continents. Ordinary citizens worked alongside scientists, teachers, and students. Each contribution was valued. Each discovery mattered. The message was no longer just a response to a council's banishment. It was a reflection of humanity's collective effort, awareness, and growth. When the final transmission was ready, the world paused. People gathered around screens, radios, and observatories. In homes, classrooms, and public spaces, humans prepared to send their voice into the cosmos. The moment was both technical and profoundly human. It was a declaration that Earth had learned to listen, that it could respond with awareness and care, and that humanity would not be silent again. In one small apartment, the technician responsible for sending the message took a deep breath. Every frequency, every symbol, every layer had been tested and retested. Every element carried meaning. With a single command, the transmission began. The signal spread outward, reaching beyond Earth's atmosphere, traveling into the depths of space. Humanity's reply was not a shout, not a demand, not a threat. It was a careful, deliberate, and human expression. We have listened, we have learned, and we are ready. Across the world, people watched as the message was sent. Families held hands. Students stared at the stars. Scientists and engineers recorded data. Ordinary citizens felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The effort had been collective, human, and profound. Humanity had turned decades of silence into a single, coherent, and meaningful response. And in that moment, a sense of connection began to grow. Though no reply had yet been received from the Council, Earth had reclaimed its voice. People understood that silence was no longer an option, that attention, responsibility, and collaboration were essential. Humanity had learned its lesson and acted on it together. For the first time in decades, the stars seemed closer. The universe no longer felt distant and unknowable. Humanity had spoken, and the echo of that voice carried far beyond the blue sky, reaching out to an audience that had waited patiently, watched carefully, and finally received a reply. After the transmission was sent, a calm yet intense and people who had worked for months, uncovering decades of hidden messages, decoding signals, and crafting humanity's reply, now waited together. The world felt connected in a way it never had before. Streets, homes, and observatories were quieter than usual. It was as if everyone collectively held their breath, aware that history had shifted. In the labs, technicians monitored every system carefully. Data flowed in from satellites and antennas, recording the outgoing signal, confirming its integrity, and ensuring that nothing interfered with its path. Engineers exchanged quiet words of encouragement. They knew the technical feat was remarkable, but the emotional weight was even greater. This was humanity's first deliberate voice, reaching beyond Earth, in response to a higher order that had been patient for decades. Ordinary citizens were watching too. In homes and public spaces, people spoke softly, sharing hopes and fears. Some whispered that this was the moment to finally prove humanity's readiness. Others simply stared at the stars, realizing how fragile yet capable their species had become. Children, usually unaware of cosmic events, felt the importance of paying attention. They sensed that the world was holding its breath with them, and that small actions like noticing, sharing, and learning had become profound. In classrooms, teachers encouraged students to document their feelings and reflections. Young minds considered what it meant to be a species capable of listening, learning, and responding. Students wrote essays, drew diagrams, and even composed small musical pieces inspired by the Council's signals. These exercises helped humans understand not only the technical aspects of communication, but also the moral and ethical responsibility that came with being heard. Meanwhile, INTERNATIONAL research teams continued to analyze the outgoing message. Linguists, mathematicians, artists, and engineers collaborated, checking every symbol, frequency, and layer. The message had to be clear, complete, and accurate. Errors could mislead, confuse, or even damage the trust humanity was building. Every detail mattered. The process was meticulous, often frustrating, yet inspiring. Scientists marveled at how a species could unite with patience, intelligence, and care to speak with one voice. On a quiet evening, a retired engineer reflected on the journey. He had witnessed the blocking of messages decades ago, felt regret for missed opportunities, and now watched as humanity finally acted with awareness. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed old files alongside the newly transmitted message. He realized that humanity's success was not just technical, it was profoundly human. People had worked together, learned from mistakes, and embraced responsibility. That was what the Council had likely intended all along, a species capable of learning, reflecting, and responding. Across the world, communities followed the progress of the transmission. Families, neighbors, and friends shared stories of their contributions, no matter how small. Some had documented old radio anomalies. Others had decoded partial signals or translated messages. Every contribution mattered. People realized that collective effort, attention, and care had transformed decades of silence into a single, meaningful voice. Humanity had acted as one, not just technologically, but morally and ethically. Weeks passed with no immediate response. The initial excitement gave way to quiet reflection. Many wondered if the Council had even received the message, or if it would respond at all. Some feared that decades of silence might be permanent. Yet the world remained engaged. People continued their observations, careful to record anomalies and changes, aware that the universe did not operate on human timelines. Patience had been a lesson already learned. In small towns, students and hobbyists continued experiments. They monitored the skies, scanned radio frequencies, and charted cosmic events. Every unusual signal, every faint pattern, was carefully logged. Even without a reply, people felt connected. Humanity had taken its first step in dialogue, demonstrating attention, care, and responsibility. The act of sending the message had become more important than the response. Humanity had found its voice. Then, unexpectedly, the first signal arrived. It was faint, unlike anything recorded before. At first, technicians thought it might be noise, but the patterns were deliberate, organized, layered, and unmistakably intentional. Analysts worked frantically, decoding symbols, harmonics, and instructions. The council was responding. The world held its collective breath as the first true communication arrived. The content of the message was astonishing. It began with acknowledgement. Earth had been heard, humanity had learned, and patience had been recognized. The council expressed neither anger nor punishment. Instead, it offered guidance, encouragement, and a cautious invitation to continued communication. Every word, every tone reflected centuries of observation and understanding. The message was designed to confirm humanity's awareness and readiness, while encouraging humility and responsibility. In homes and observatories worldwide, people gathered to observe the decoding. Families watched together, neighbors shared news in whispers, and students followed along with charts and diagrams. For the first time, humans realized they were participating in a conversation with beings beyond their planet. The moment was deeply emotional. There were tears, smiles, and quiet awe. Humanity had been heard, and the universe had acknowledged it. Scientists and engineers began analyzing the council's reply in detail. It contained technical data about cosmic patterns, suggestions for communication protocols, and subtle guidance for future development. But the most striking elements were human-centric, reflections on collaboration, responsibility, and awareness. The council's message emphasized that the ability to listen, learn, and act was as important as technical capability. Humanity was being judged not just by its achievements, but by its character. In classrooms, teachers used the council's reply as an opportunity to inspire young minds. Students studied the patterns, explored the principles behind the communication, and discussed what it meant to be responsible observers of the universe. Lessons included ethics, attention, collaboration, and the importance of preserving knowledge. Students understood that their role was ongoing, that humanity's voice must be maintained, nurtured, and heard consistently. Ordinary citizens felt a renewed sense of purpose. Those who had contributed to the message, whether by decoding signals, translating patterns, or observing anomalies, felt recognized in the collective effort. The reply from the council validated decades of work and learning. People realized that the mistakes of the past had not defined them. Instead, their efforts to correct those mistakes had created a bridge to the universe. In quiet neighborhoods, families discussed the significance of the moment. Parents explained to children how humanity had been silenced, how individuals had discovered anomalies, and how collective effort had finally allowed Earth to speak. Children listened, captivated by the story of responsibility and collaboration. For many, it was a lesson in morality and awareness as much as science and technology. Humanity had learned to pay attention, to act deliberately, and to value connection. Meanwhile, governments continued to study the council's message. Policies and protocols were updated to ensure that future signals could never be blocked again. International collaboration increased as countries realized the importance of transparency and shared responsibility. Scientific conferences discussed not only the technical aspects of the reply, but also the ethical and societal implications. Humanity was transforming, not just technologically, but morally and socially. In remote areas, Amateur astronomers and hobbyists contributed to decoding and analysis. Every small observation mattered. Patterns once ignored were now celebrated. Communities that had been quiet observers suddenly became active participants in humanity's first interstellar conversation. People felt the thrill of responsibility, the pride of contribution, and the humility of realizing that the universe's patience had given humanity a second chance. Artists and musicians found inspiration in the Council's message. They created works reflecting the themes of listening, learning, and awareness. Music, paintings, and literature captured the emotions of a species finally finding its voice. Schools and museums displayed these works, reminding everyone that human expression, emotion, creativity, and reflection was as important as technology in connecting with the universe. As the days passed, the full scope of the Council's reply became clearer. It included suggestions for cooperative observation, reminders of ethical responsibility, and subtle encouragement to maintain humanity's awareness and vigilance. The message emphasized humility, patience, and continuous learning. Humans realized that interstellar communication was not merely a technical task, but a moral and social one. The lessons from decades of silence had been understood, and humanity was ready to continue. People around the world felt a profound shift in perspective. The universe no longer seemed distant and unknowable. Humanity had participated, learned, and acted. Every citizen understood, in some way, that attention, observation, and collaboration mattered. Ordinary actions, recording a detail, sharing information, paying attention to anomalies, were now recognized as vital to the survival and growth of the species, capable of interstellar dialogue. In homes, schools, and labs, humans reflected on the journey. Decades of missed messages, blocked signals, and misunderstood.